Hi, this is Amy
and Melissa. We are a couple of retired Texas teachers who are CALTs, Certified Academic Language Therapists. We started our own businesses, and now we have a podcast called
The Dyslexia Duo. So join us for our informative podcast, where we'll delve into dyslexia, covering the topics that affect parents, therapists, teachers, practitioners, and anyone who wants to learn more. We'll guide you through everything you need to know, from the first signs to the intricacies of dyslexia curriculum placement and beyond.
This season, we will cover the referral process, what to expect when your child or student is dyslexic, the generational impacts of dyslexia, and how to support those affected.
Come join us! Thank you so much for joining us again as we resume our conversation with the amazing Dr. Nancy Mather. You had mentioned early in your career that you worked with behavior students. Is that right? And that's how it led you to dyslexia research?
Uh-huh.
I tell people that I work with a lot, it's not unusual to see behaviors because they either withdraw or they act out because it's easier to be, and I'm doing air quotes, and I know people listening on a podcast can't see my air quotes, but it's easier to be the bad kid than to be the quote unquote dumb kid. They'd rather act out sometimes and avoid it. So how does dyslexia, in your experience, affect self-esteem?
Well, as you just mentioned, I think they either withdraw or act out. And so either one can happen. Well, a lot of the kids, they just withdraw. They won't ever volunteer to read. They don't ever hold up their hand. They try not to talk or interact, and they, tend to withdraw. I'm just thinking about one student who had, ADHD, but she was very sullen, and, it was mostly just focus, not hyperactivity. But someone said to her, in order to get attention, you got to throw a book on the floor or something. You got to act out in order to get attention. So sometimes these kids who are withdrawn don't get attention because they're not causing problems. They're quiet, right? But they're suffering, or then again, the kids, act out, as I say. By the time, with these middle school students, they were angry. They were angry and felt like school wasn't a place for them. Definitely, contributes to self-esteem. It's interesting. I remember looking at a study one time where it had adults with dyslexia list what their greatest problems were as adults, and the number one thing was self-esteem. And so still as adults, they, suffer from this feeling of inadequacy because they struggled with reading and struggled in school. And so it continues to affect people, even into adulthood.
Yeah, it's something you hold on to. I mean, you're impacted as a young child, and you can't shake it.
Yeah.
You can't shake that.
Talking a little bit, kind of switching gears to orthography. I've heard a lot of talks about orthography, orthographic mapping, orthographic processing, and I would like to break this down in a few steps just so everybody can kind of understand the progression of it. But what is orthography to you?
Okay. And this is something I've been interested in for the last 25 years or more. But, essentially, orthography is just the writing system of a language. And so it includes the spelling patterns, punctuation rules, capitalization. So it's all the rules, of the writing system. But, more specifically with dyslexia, sort of orthographic processing is sort of your brain's ability to recall these rules, remember patterns, remember spelling patterns, remember a pattern like IGHT, when you're spelling. And so the ability to sort of recall written words. And orthographic mapping is that process then of mapping the speech sounds, the phonemes, to the print. And so making the connection. Like you see they have the word man, n, and then you map those phonemes to the graphemes. And with typically developing readers, when they've seen that whole word 1 to 4 times, it's automatized. They know it as a sight word. But with our kids with dyslexia, that can take a really long time. It can take a really long time. I mean, I can think of second grade students I've worked with, and, they're sounding out the word it. And you think, how many times have you seen that word and you still don't know it as a sight word? It's like, how many times, how is it going to take until that becomes automatized as a sight word? And so I think with a lot of our kids, it's really this orthographic mapping that's part of the big problem, that there's just not the retention then in as words as sight words. And so they're very slow to develop a sight word vocabulary.
If a child has dyslexia, do you think most of them have the difficulty with orthographic mapping?
Again, it's not all or most, or,
Okay.
some it's rapid naming, some it's working memory. So some some is phonological processing. And once they get work with speech sounds and understand that, in some cases, it's kind of resolved that issue. But lots of times what happens is it starts out as a phonological processing problem, but then you're left with an orthographic processing problem. They spell words just like they sound. They put the sounds in order. They're very good at that, but they're still not recalling in the spelling patterns, still slow to build, sight words and things like that. But, I think with a lot of our students with dyslexia, this orthographic mapping is difficult. And that's why we see so many of the interventions focusing on helping kids with that process, and providing lots of practice, lots of repetition.
So the cards, the ARD cards, the IRD cards that we use in therapy are really to trigger that orthographic mapping. Is that correct?
Yeah, you map the speech sounds to the print. And so it's that process. And so, you think again, there's several steps involved in that. You've got to break apart the speech sounds, right? The first things you got to do, right? You got the speech sounds separate, then you got to map them to the letters and then blend it back together, form a whole word, look at the word, and, again, then retain the word once you've seen it several times, hopefully.
So that's why, too, it's so important for them to say the sound, name the letter, write the letter, and then read the word afterwards, because that's just triggering that orthographic mapping. Is that correct?
Yeah, and just providing repetition, needed to master the letter, the sound, and providing that repetition.
I've heard about repetition for gifted learners, for traditional learners, for dyslexic learners. Have you, I'm sure you've heard it because you're the researcher and not me, but what are the repetitions involved for someone who's gifted and someone who's a traditional learner and someone who might be a dyslexic learner for learning a particular concept?
That's an interesting question. Repetitions are necessary for any learner when the material is difficult for them.
Right.
And so I don't think it makes much of a difference whether gifted, traditional, dyslexic. It's just when material is difficult, it requires breaking it down in repetition. Okay.
Okay.
And so, that's just sort of a necessary step when you encounter material that's too difficult for you, to understand without help, essentially, right? But, it's particularly critical with our students with dyslexia, just because many of them have problems with memory and attention, and so it becomes, probably, even more critical for those students with dyslexia.
So that kind of feeds into the automaticity piece that we were referring to. If it's not automatic and brought to the forefront at that moment, they won't be successful with what they're reading. They won't be successful with what they're spelling. Can you talk a little bit about reading and spelling and automaticity just a little bit more?
Well, just, again, having that ease in terms of reading words and spelling words is what frees up your cognitive resources to think, essentially, and reason. And you're not focused on, basic skills. There's been a lot of research showing that establishing this automaticity takes time, takes time.
Thinking about all of that, the taking time and how difficult of a load that is for students with dyslexia to try to spell, knowing that they have to do so many different steps in order to commit this to their memory. If a student does have to take a spelling test, say in their classroom, what recommendations would you make to ensure success for them?
Okay, so if they have to take, a spelling test, a couple suggestions I would make. One is to mark the number right, not the number wrong, and put a big plus by it. +5, not like -15, okay? So big plus with a happy smiley face by it. It's better to have a spelling test that's a pattern. And so it's like, the IGHT family, and all those words are spelled with IGHT. So having a spelling test, that's a pattern. You can also, use words that they're misspelling in their writing that are common high frequency words and target, those as well. Students with dyslexia need, a different type of spelling instruction than kids who learn, to spell easily. You can make a modification. I'm thinking about Matthew, who was in 5th grade, and the teachers told Matthew, okay, I'm not going to give you 20 words on your spelling test. I'm going to give you 5 words, okay? And that's all we're going to grade. I'm going to give you 5 words to spell. He says, I want to take 20 words like everybody else. Kids don't like to be different. And she said, okay, you take all 20 like everybody else, but I'm just grading the first 5. That's what you're responsible for. So it's a private pact with the teacher and Matthew. He looks like everybody else. He takes the 20 words, right? And so just kind of remembering with accommodations, even older students, you don't like to feel different. You don't feel like I'm the only one in the room that has a whatever it is. Kids don't, like that. But I think one of the most effective ways working with kids with dyslexia with spelling, instead of doing a fixed spelling list where they have to memorize X amount of words on Friday, do a flow list. And with the flow list, what it is daily testing of like 3 words, 5 words, until they get it right 3 days in a row. Then you put it back in the box. You check it a week later, you see, do they still know it? If they don't, it goes back on the flow list again. If they do, it goes back in the box. And so again, just all that reinforcement, all that repetition in things, and selecting words that they're misspelling in their writing. Or else the first step with spelling is you've got to be able to put sounds in order. So that's our first goal, put the sounds in order. But once they have the sounds in order, we have to start teaching them about spelling patterns.
Spelling is complicated.
Yeah, well, it is, but and again, I can think of so many kids with dyslexia just telling you how much they hate spelling because it's so hard for them. So I think, again, trying to make a spelling program that's very positive.
Yes.
Very positive. And that's why I say put a +5 and a happy face, it's like, good job. Spelling is really hard for these kids. And so don't make it punitive.
Right. I can remember a student that I know of that when she did her spelling test in class, she did okay, but the teacher took off for something that wasn't a spelling objective, numbering the words, and she put number in the parentheses around it, but she didn't put the period after the number. And so she took off every time there wasn't a period. I thought, that's not even a spelling objective. Why would you do something like that? So, yeah, making sure for sure that it's a spelling objective. So kind of jumping into irregular words and maybe even homophones. I can remember seeing some of my dyslexia therapy kids who would take the spelling test in the classroom, and then they show me their list and their irregular words for spelling. Or even homophones. My goodness, that's a hard one for them to differentiate. What would be some recommendations that you would make for at least spelling with irregular words or even homophones?
So the first thing with irregular words, we want to teach the student that not all the sounds are irregular. So let's look at this word and see what's irregular. So if we think about the word said, the S is regular, so is the D. It's just that AI in the middle. Okay, so we've got to highlight that AI, right? I mean, one kind of fun thing to do is put a big heart around it and say, this is the part you got to memorize by heart, or make it bright red, or make it bigger print or something, just to really draw attention with them. And then have them say the sound, the S sound, and then the letters AI, and then the D sound. You don't have to memorize S and the D. You just have to memorize that piece of this word. And so really, again, it's not all irregular. Every once in a while, you just have to give them some kind of mnemonic or something to help them. I remember Ben is in 5th grade. He's spelling wood, W-U-D, should, S-U-D, S-H-U-D, right? Could, C-U-D. I said, okay, Ben, when you're writing those, just say, oh, you little dog. Oh, you little dog.
That's a good
He
one.
never spelled would, could, and should again, but you would see him then sitting there writing and going, oh, you little dog. I mean,
How cute.
my guess is he even still says that just to help him with those patterns. But, so sometimes you got to give them some kind of, mnemonic with the pattern just so they can, memorize it. But
I can see that relating to reading as well, like with the sight word said and putting a heart around the A and the I and just remembering that this is making a different sound. You're going to have to remember that when you see this word. I think that's a great strategy to use.
Yeah, we do something similar to that in my therapy sessions as well. And we even bring back in, what's the initial sound that you hear? Okay, what letter do you use for that? And then we talk about the letter we would put down. So they are also tapping back into that phonological awareness as well.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors.
Hi, this is Melissa with Kids First Dyslexia Services. I am excited to share with you my private practice. Kids First Dyslexia Services is a private practice that specializes in dyslexia therapy. Each one-on-one session focuses on instruction specific to your child's needs in a nurturing environment that develops self-esteem, builds confidence, and fosters a sense of accomplishment, resulting in happier kids with higher levels of achievement. We provide a professional, personalized experience, always putting the child first. We value the relationships with both our students and parents because strengthening skills and overcoming hurdles to achieve desired goals and success is a team effort. For more information, please visit www.kidsfirstdyslexia.com. That is www.kidsfirstdyslexia.com.
Hi there. This is Amy Rodenroth, owner of Discovery Dyslexia Services. So tell me if any of these situations are familiar to you. Your dyslexia teacher / therapist has suddenly retired unexpectedly, and you do not have the personnel to fill the space. Or you do not have enough trained teachers or therapists for the number of students who have qualified for dyslexia services, and you need a trained teacher or therapist quickly, like yesterday quickly. Or you need a teacher to provide compensatory services, and you do not have anyone that can provide what's needed. Well, what do you do? I'm going to tell you what you can do. You can call Discovery Dyslexia Services. Discovery Dyslexia Services can help you with your various dyslexia concerns. We have multiple CALTs who can provide virtual small group therapy. We can also train your teachers in most dyslexia curricula, either virtually or on site. Just let us know how we can help support you. For more information, go to our website at www.discovereed.com. Let me spell that for you. DYSCOVEREAD.com. And I know it's a funny name, but we're providing huge services for our dyslexic population. So keep in mind, Discovery Dyslexia Services, covering all your dyslexia needs. The Dyslexia Duo wants to know, do you want to get your name out there? Well, we can help you gain brand awareness. We build better brands simply by taking your own vision for your business and helping it reach a wide variety of audiences.
Benefits to advertising on the Dyslexia Duo podcast include direct access to a diverse audience of parents, caregivers, and educators, association with experts in the field. Also, continuous traffic to the podcast means repeated exposure to your brand. You will be supporting a small business that advocates for children's education and options available to obtain measurable results.
Just contact us either through Facebook at the Dyslexia Duo or through email, thedyslexiaduo@gmail.com.
Thank you.
Let's return to the show.
So, a little bit about dyslexia and IDEA. Here in Texas, it's kind of new that we're under special education now. We were under 504. There was, of course, special education pathways as well, but we had kind of two different pathways where kids could be identified with a 504 pathway and under IDEA as well. Now we're identified under the same umbrella. So can you tell me a little bit about dyslexia and how it falls under the IDEA eligibility for a specific learning disability?
Right. And so dyslexia, as you know, there's, the three areas in reading, and, dyslexia would fit under basic reading skills, and then reading, fluency. If it's primarily a problem in reading comprehension, the cause is not poor decoding, that's not dyslexia. Okay. And so it would just be basic reading skills and reading fluency under IDEA that the student would qualify. But again, we've got kids that have developmental language disorder and dyslexia, and they have problems in both decoding and reading comprehension. Right. And so, in that case, it could also fall under reading comprehension when there's comorbid language disorders.
Okay, because in Texas, sometimes we have thought about the twice exceptional students and how sometimes they might not look like they qualify for dyslexia because they have above average abilities in other areas. So can you talk a little bit about that and how that might impact their identification?
Well, in terms of twice exceptional students, again, that can be complicated because many times these students have scores within the average range, but they're so bright, and average isn't good enough for these kids. And so, that's when we talk about looking at discrepancies between oral language, reasoning, and their reading, writing ability. And so I think in those cases, like ability achievement discrepancies are pretty useful to show this person should be doing a lot better than they're doing. This student should be doing a lot better. And average isn't good enough for this student. This student should be a superior reader. It's complicated with those twice exceptional kids because sometimes their scores look like they're doing okay, but okay is really not good enough for these kids. They should be doing better.
Yeah, you're right. And I think that is a area for growth. And I know in our state, sometimes I've had students who they said, well, they don't really meet the criteria because they're showing that they're average and X, Y, and Z qualifying factors. But we talk about all the areas of which they're excelling. And we're saying, well, they're still having these issues that are characteristic of dyslexia. What is the cause if it's not dyslexia? So we've run into that, and I hope that that's an area of growth as we continue to spread the word.
And so many times these kids are identified in post-secondary, not, high school and things like that. They get to college, and all of a sudden the reading demands are so great, they're lost. They can't keep up, and they get an evaluation then. Well, you have dyslexia, And so sometimes, again, it's not diagnosed until you get to the point that there's just so much reading, you can't do it. You can't keep up. You can't read fast enough and things like that. But it is tricky with diagnosing these twice exceptional kids because, again, someone will say, well, they're doing fine. They're average, It's like, well, average isn't good enough for this student, But again, it's one of those complicating problems in terms of diagnosis.
It really takes people to put in the effort, the extra work, looking deeply at all of the information presented to them to get the appropriate diagnosis or identification.
Absolutely. Well, and again, adding in things like family history, other information, right? The preponderance of evidence,
Yes.
So adding that in.
So, we have, like I said, Texas Dyslexia and Law in place since 1985. We've had a handbook since 1986. I know states are in different states are in a state of flux about dyslexia. Really, there's different criteria that every state has for saying dyslexia, but and maybe this is me just not looking at it the right way. People seem to be okay with talking about autism and making autism identifications. But when it comes to dyslexia, we're not getting our kids identified like they should be or appropriately or providing appropriate services. Why do you think there are states that are still opposed to talking about dyslexia and providing that dyslexia label? I've heard from other states where they say, oh, we don't say dyslexia here. What do you say? How are they going to get the services they need? What are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, and again, you're very right. There are places where they say we don't use that term. They may say it's a medical diagnosis, which was believed to be at one time, or we don't say that. And what happens is, well, he has a learning disability and basic reading skills, and then the parent will say, well, does that mean he has dyslexia? Because the parent has heard about dyslexia, so then they're like, well, what is this? I'm sure you're familiar with the 2015 memo from the Office of Education, where
Yes.
they said it's appropriate to use the terms dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia in IEPs, in evaluations, etc. So the government essentially said it's fine, it's appropriate to use these terms, in schools. But, it's interesting, there's still reluctance some places, to say the word. They've been kind of taught you can't say that. You can't say that.
Yeah.
And so, but I think change is starting to happen.
Yeah.
And so I think there's more dyslexia awareness than there has been, and so I think that's starting, to change a bit. But just encouraging people to say, okay, if you have to say it's an IDEA category, it's a specific learning disability and basic reading skills, also known as dyslexia. And so just to clarify that, take the mystery out of it again. But if you're just thinking IDEA categories, dyslexia, falls under it, but it's not one of the categories. And so I think, again, if you're in a school that only talks IDEA categories, you may be reluctant, to say that.
You said it's yourself when we talked about the history of dyslexia. It's the late 1800s, early 1900s. They've had 100 or so years to kind of get with it and start talking about it a little more and start looking at our students. So, I hope change is coming. I really do. I really do.
I was also wondering, I get a lot of parents who come to me and they get the identification and they say to me, okay, so what do you recommend we do at home to help our child? And of course, I always recommend read to them. I feel like that's the best recommendation that I can provide at that time. But I also think it's important for them to look around and talk about vocabulary words, talk about what things mean, identify what's in their environment, and ask them questions about how their day was and things of that nature. What do you recommend for parents to develop their child's reading skills?
Well, it makes me think of a couple of things. It's important to keep reading being fun in the home. So the parent can read a paragraph and have the child follow along and then have the child read the paragraph back to them. So that's like a really good method for working, on reading. And maybe the parent even needs to read it twice before the child can read it. So if they want to do something like that, that can be very helpful. As you know, it's important for parents to get a really good reading tutor to work with their child. I don't recommend parents do that because it kind of changes the role, and can create sort of anger and frustration between child and parent. Parent gets frustrated. Why can't you remember that? I just told you that, I mean, so getting, a really good reading tutor, there's some really good computer programs out there that parents can use at home with their child, and, just have them do half an hour, 3 times a week or 5 days a week or something like that. So there's some really good programs that they can, access. Just trying to create a love for reading, in the home. Finding some books that are of real high interest to the child, and, just reading to them before they go to sleep and things like that. Some, story that, something that they're really interested in, or something that the kids in their class are reading that they can't read on their own, so they can talk to their friends about it. Oh, we were reading X and X last night, and that was really neat. And so helping them feel included in what kids are reading in their classroom that are too hard for them to read independently. So
Those are great tips. I have a son of my own. He's 24. And I have said to him recently, I was like, do you think I read to you enough? I don't know if I read to you enough. He goes, Mom, you read to me every night. I was like, okay, good. Phew.
That's funny. Yeah, and we had to do the funny voices too.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can still hear "Go Dog Go" by our producer reading him to our daughter. He's over here laughing. So one of our other questions that we have is, if you could just grant any wish for our dyslexic students, or just our parents of dyslexia or whatever, but if you could grant any wish for our students with dyslexia, what would that be? What would Dr. Mather want to grant?
I'm thinking Lisa Kay, and she has a website called Dyslexia Inspired. It's sort of nice. I mean, she's got all kinds of sort of sayings to, help support people with dyslexia that are very, positive about dyslexia. But one of the things she says on one of her slides, she says, imagine a time when people with dyslexia can say they had a wonderful school experience with proper help, supports, and understanding of their unique strengths and learning needs. So that's what I would hope. We get to the point that all children with dyslexia feel like they had a wonderful school experience. And we know that's possible. You look at some of these private schools for kids with dyslexia, these kids are thriving. They're having fun. They love school. And so it's very, very possible. So I would just hope that we try to create a climate in our school where all children have a positive, wonderful experience and love going to school and love learning. That's what I would hope.
I think that's great. I do have one question. So in one of our other podcasts, we had asked our guest speaker what books she recommended, and I thought it was just kind of a one-off question, but I had somebody reach out to me and say, oh my gosh, I love when you talk about books and resources because I want to add to mine. So what books do you have that you would recommend to parents or teachers or whatever about dyslexia? Or what books do you recommend?
Depends a little bit about how deep a dive a parent wants to take in dyslexia. Jan Hasbrook has a nice book, Conquering Dyslexia. Sally Shaywitz's book, Overcoming Dyslexia, but you're taking a pretty deep dive in that one.
Yeah.
So it just depends a little bit on, how much you want to learn about. But, the truth is, the more a parent knows about dyslexia, the better advocate they can be for their child.
Right.
And so, pretty soon, people realize this parent knows probably more about dyslexia than anyone in the school, perhaps. I mean, and so I think arming yourself with knowledge about dyslexia really pays off in terms of being able to advocate for your child and make sure they get the supports that they need and the understanding, that they need. And, also, I think being able to pick teachers for children with dyslexia. So not just they get whoever, but it's important we really pick teachers, because there's teachers who have good understanding, empathy, and they're great with these kids. And then there are others teachers that just, not so many, but they don't have much of an understanding. They think the child's being lazy. They don't know how to teach them. They're frustrated. And not so many of those, but children with dyslexia can't afford a year in a classroom with a teacher who doesn't understand them
Right.
and support them. They can't afford that. That's when the real self-esteem stuff starts. And so making sure we get the right teacher, each year, for our children, because, that just makes a huge difference.
And proper accommodations.
Yeah.
I know we
Yeah.
didn't really talk about accommodations very much, and I didn't know if you feel like you want to touch on that topic really quickly, but accommodations in the classroom are vital to a child's success. Do you have any that you feel like would be most helpful to helping these kids?
Well, obviously in terms of accommodations with students with dyslexia, the most critical one is getting more time or shorter assignments, I mean, so you'll talk to some of these kids with dyslexia and, they spent 2.5 hours on their homework where another student spent a half an hour, right? I mean, so, just saying things like, I want you to read tonight for 30 minutes. And so that makes it, you read 15 pages, great. You read 75 pages, great. But, and so trying to set things up so it's equitable in terms of the amount of time kids spend and the amount of energy. And as students age in school too, having extended time on exams is critical so that they can really demonstrate what they know and they get to see all the questions, rather than how fast they can read. And so we really have to take the pressure off in terms of these timed exams where, a student with dyslexia will say, I got halfway through and the time was up, and I never even saw the last 30 questions, and then they just start guessing on things anyway. So with older students, extended time is, critical. And then just modifications that ensure that the child can be successful. And that's going to vary from individual student to individual student. What's it going to take for the student to be successful in my spelling program, in my reading program? What's it going to take to make them successful, right?
Absolutely.
That takes a really good team approach with the parent and the teacher, prior teachers if necessary, everybody having a weigh in on that.
Absolutely. Well, I think, is that all we have? That went by really fast. Wow. Okay.
Time flies when you're having fun and learning a lot.
Oh my gosh, you should see our notes. So many notes, so little time. Well, Dr. Mathers, I keep trying to make you plural. I keep calling you Dr. Mathers when I'm talking to somebody. I'm like, no, she's singular. Dr. Mathers. I appreciate that you came on our podcast today. You're just, like I said, you have some of the greatest presentations that I've seen when I've seen you at IDA or even, I think, Alta maybe some years ago. And I was just so excited that you said you could come on the show. Thank you for taking time out of your busy weekend to record this session with us.
Been delightful to be here with you. And IDA is in Dallas next year.
I know. We're going to be there. The Dyslexia Duo is going to be there.
I just heard I got accepted, so come see me.
Yes, we will.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're going to be there recording a podcast live.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Great.
So you come see us too.
Okay, for sure.
Thank you so much for your time. I love doing assessments. I actually would like to go that pathway and do diagnostician work, but I'm scared of the statistics because I'm horrible at math. I think I have dyscalculia myself. Never been diagnosed, but I do believe I have that. Anyway, I love the assessment piece. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, and I appreciate all of your time.
Okay, well, great. Thank you.
The Dyslexia Duo podcast hosts are Amy Rodenroth.
Melissa Dean.
Our producer is Greg Rodenroth.
You can find us on Facebook at The Dyslexia Duo.
email us any questions or comments at thedyslexiaduo@gmail.com.
Awareness is so important. Share this podcast with your friends
Family,
and teachers.
thanks for joining us.
Bye.